So I'm going to cue you to go out to cue them to cue the next word. Don't worry about the camera, just let it roll.
Okay. You want me to still here?
Yeah, just hang right around here. All right. So welcome everyone. What we're going to do today is we're going to actually use the material from the midterm to talk about some actual novel foods that we're going to eat. So today I would like to introduce the executive chef for the university, Chef BJ Nair. So Chef Nair actually started his training as early as 1996 in Trivedon? How do you say your city? The city?
Yeah, it's a southern province in Kerala.
Kerala. And after he worked many years throughout India, he immigrated to Canada in 2003, where he worked through the Toronto hotel circuit. He also has worked for Royal Caribbean and joined the University of Guelph in 2010 as a sous vide chef and moved his, and then moved his way to executive chef in 2015. And something I don't think maybe we take for granted here at the University of Guelph is he oversees 7 production kitchens, 3 sous chefs, 4 head cooks, 22 cooks, 20 apprentices, and prepares on average 15,000 meals a day. As well, while he's been operating the 19 outlets at the University of Guelph, he has had the distinction of being, as voted by you, the students, for 10 consecutive years, top food on a university campus. So a huge accomplishment. Perfect, so we can start the first one. Yep, all right. So the first thing we're gonna have today is a ganchu pulled pork sliders with pickled red onions. So as they serve, before we get going, does anyone not have cutlery? A few people? Okay, so let's get some cutlery to come through. We have a few people without cutlery. I can hand that out. Boom, boom. Boom, boom. I think about maybe 10.
Do you hand him so?
Doesn't matter. I can do it. I like getting my hands dirty. Thank you. Perfect. And I'll grab that one, and then I'll come back if I need more.
Perfect.
Thanks. Hands up again, who needs them? So please keep the cutlery until the end, and keep the dishes until the end, and then on the way out, there's going to be some garbage pails on the way out that you can actually just throw out everything in one swing. Do you need one too?
I got one.
Okay. You're okay? I think we need one more, Nawaz. 2 more, Nawaz.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Thank you.
All right. So what today's going to serve as what we're going as we go through the different meals, I'm going to point out some of the topics we talked about to try to again highlight some of the importance of the chemistry we've been talking about for the last semester. And I'll kind of talk as they come through and keep serving. So remember, again, just with the idea and the sight of food, we actually initiate that cephalic response. So many of you are probably already starting to anticipate the food that's going to be coming out. And again, the idea that, why is this not going? I've probably just got to unplug it and plug it back in. Yes. So even just the thought of food is enough to trigger your hypothalamus to actually start responding. So now what's happening is you're starting to get hungry. You're starting to send neural transmissions through your vagus nerve, which is starting to simulate, again, all of those digestive enzymes. And it's that interaction between the food and the body that makes for such a great experience. But it's not just a social science, it's not just the science, it's also about sustaining the human body. So we have to think about the complexity that the human body interacts with the food. So when we talk about this first one, again, whenever we talk about bread and dough and gluten, when we talk about the organoleptic properties of that food, we've got to look at, of course, probably one of the two most important reactions in food, which is the Maillard reaction. And if we talk about the Maillard reaction, remember, what are the two components we need for that Maillard reaction to progress? Yeah. Reducing sugar and protein and heat. And it has to happen in a somewhat dry environment. Why? Because it's a condensation reaction. So the presence of that water is actually feedback inhibiting that reaction from taking place. So as that product begins to dry with dry air, we begin to see this reaction between the reducing sugar and that protein, and that first complex forms that shift base. And then we get a series of rearrangements, which moves that double bond around in that molecule. And then what we get is that cleavage, right? We get the breaking up of that molecule depending on where those double bonds are. And that gives rise to the furfurols, the aldehydes, the ketones, all of the components that give you that characteristic cooked flavor. But it's not just the Maillard reaction that's happening. When you need gluten, what's happening? How are we turning wheat starch and protein into dough as we need it, as we put in mechanical energy? We're breaking that structure up. We're denaturing those proteins. We're causing disulfide bonds. That's the whole premise of that gluten network. And by doing that, kneading that dough appropriately, we're making an emulsion. There's water distributed in it. Fat shortening the gluten network. All of that dictates how the sensory properties are perceived by you. When we talk about meat and meat structure, we talk about those microfibrillar structures that actually cause water to be bound. So when we talk about meat, the juiciness of steak is dependent not only on the quality of the meat, which is determined based on time of slaughter. So was that animal stressed? Did it have lactic acid being produced? If it had lactic acid being produced, what's the pH of that meat? pH of proteins changes the ternary and quaternary structure of that protein, right? So when we talk about muscle, we're talking about a lot of what protein? Anyone know what the main protein in muscle is? Why is meat tough? Because a lot of collagen, right? And that collagen, that triple helix, that alpha helix we talked about, remember the alpha helix? The alpha helix is stabilized by hydrogen bonding between every amino acid, 4 amino acids away, right? So position 1, hydrogen bonds to position 5, 2 to 6, 3 to 7. And that network is dependent on the pH of that food. So when you use a sauce or a marinade that's acidic, you're changing the structure of that protein. By cooking it, you're gelatinizing the collagen. So the collagen is going from this supramolecular twisted alpha helix of 3 different alpha helices twisted together. It's breaking them apart into individual alpha helices. And then when that meat cools down, it actually forms a meat gel as opposed to that collagen. And that gives you the tenderness of meat. So when we talk about meat structure, it's not just about how that animal is raised, if it's grass-fed, if it's grain-fed, but how is that animal slaughtered? How is that animal transferred from the farm to the slaughterhouse? How is it slaughtered? How is that meat aged? Because again, aging changes the pH of that meat. That meat structure changes. Remember, when we talk about the structure of meat, we're talking about proteins that are fibril in the ternary structure. So when those proteins, those alpha helices fold, they form these very tough, tight alpha helices, these collagen matrix. Gelatinizing it, cooking it. The gelatinization temperature varies from species to species depending on the protein. It changes depending on how it was aged. Changes depending on how that meat is cooked. So we talk about sous vide cooking, low temperature, long times, versus a searing heat. This all changes the organoleptic properties and that sensory interaction between you and that food. Now, when we want to try to come up with novel technologies to replace meat, how do we do it? We talked about it a little bit when we looked at the Impossible Burger. And that Impossible Burger relied on wheat proteins to structure. So how do you take a globular protein and convert it to a fibrous protein? We have to add immense amounts of shear. But how do we understand and how do we get to that desirable texture? The juiciness that you're experiencing eating that pork. But what's cool about these things is we don't eat in isolation. We don't eat a single food. So what you're eating today, we're not eating a piece of bread or a piece of pork. We're eating these mixed foods. So how is that food processed in your oral cavity? Think about the kinetics of that first bite. When you take that first bite of that product, the amount of force that you have to put into it. Once you've bitten off a piece and you move it back to your molars, think about the amount of force that it's taking to compress that. How much springiness or how much recoil that bread gives you when you release that bite. All of these are sensory indicators of quality. And you're inadvertently assessing these products based on previous experience. So if you were to go buy Rice Krispie squares or Rice Krispies and you put water on them or milk on them, they're not going to snap, crackle, and pop, right? We're not going to get that sensory cue of quality. If we buy crackers and that package has been opened and they've been exposed to moisture and they start to bind that water, the brittleness, the glass transition of that food product is going to change. So again, we make sensory cues and we determine if we like it not only based on the taste of that product, but also on the sensory, on the oral processing of that food. So how can we design structures that give desirable sensory properties? Now, what's really cool about this is that you can tailor the taste profile depending on how you cook, marinate, arrange that food. So that culinary experience isn't just about taste. It's about how your body interacts with it. If you are becoming satiated by it. Now, taste is an extremely important discriminant of whether or not a product has a nutritional quality that's desirable. So by avoiding bitter foods, we're avoiding toxic compounds. So again, when we talk about all these things, they have relevance to sitting and actually consuming a meal. Now I'm going to pause here. Is Ella Nutra here, the Twitter handle? It's a good thing if you're here. No? No Ella N-U-T-R? Is that someone? No? Oh, I was going to give her a free shirt for being the most active on Twitter. Anyhow, I have two shirts that I got. This one's from American Gut. It looks like a child shirt, so it's going to have to be someone really small that gets this shirt. And it says, I love this shirt, "Free up the porty potty. I've got science to do," for the gut microbiome. So who wants a small t-shirt? We'll go. There you go. Oh yeah, I'm not going to throw it. I felt like I was gonna, and then I'm like, it's just not cool. Like if I was an athlete, maybe. But as an overweight professor, I don't think I'm going to throw it my shoulder. And here, we'll go to you. This is from Cheeseburger. This is where we got the Impossible Burgers.
Thank you.
They were free things I got. And they obviously didn't fit me, so. All right. We're ready when you are for the next round. No hurry, though. Any questions on the first round? Thoughts? What's that? Sorry?
What are the onions pickled with?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, oops. All right. So one of the things, again, I really want to try to highlight here is when we talk about the chemistry of foods, the chemistry of foods is often dictated by the shelf life. So when we structure foods or when we change or preserve foods, they have implications on how you perceive them. So this often is a challenge when we talk about the mass production of foods. But from a culinology experience, you can do a lot more really cool and interesting things than you can with an industrialized product, right? If we're worried about an industrial product, we have to think about what is the shelf life? What are we going to add to increase the shelf life of that product, right? So when we talk about doughs, how much salt do we need to add is dependent on how long we want that shelf life to be. Salt is also extremely important when we talk about the structure of gluten. Has anyone ever tried to make salt-free bread? It's not good. But it's not because of the flavor. The flavor of salt is important. But again, when we talk about the structure of protein, the protein solubility and the structure of that network is dependent on pH. It's dependent on the amount of water that's present. And in being dependent on the amount of water that's present, it's highly dependent on the amount of salt and the amount of sugar. So not only do you get that sensory perception based on that product, but you also get that structure, that chewiness, the gumminess of bread, which is all part of the culinary experience. So next, we have a butternut squash ravioli with sage brown butter, not margarine, and cider cream foam. So now when we talk about this, when we think about this product, remember what's happening. When you take a starch gel, when you put starch into a product, that amylose and that amylopectin, the basis of what makes good pasta, that ratio of the amylose and the amylopectin is dependent on the source of starch you take. The size of that starch granule is dependent on your source, how you process it. So when you mix those ingredients together, incorporate them with water, and then begin to heat, that product, those granules, begin to swell, right? So as those starch granules that contain amylose and amylopectin begin to swell, they begin to increase the viscosity because those granules begin to imbibe on each other. Once this happens, the viscosity goes up. Now, depending on how you cook it, you can actually rupture the starch granule structure, or you can keep the granule intact. Irrespective of that, that structure that's being produced from the ravioli is dependent on the source of starch you use. So if you use a cornstarch or a tapioca starch, the structure of that pasta will differ. As that starch granule begins to swell, water is beginning to diffuse into that crystal aggregate. As water begins to diffuse in, again, what do we need to get that water to move into the granule? What do we have to apply? Heat. We have to weaken the hydrogen bonding between amylose granules or amylose molecules. How do you do that? You move above 40 degrees Celsius, right? So as hydrogen bonding, as temperature goes up, hydrogen bonding strength goes down. As hydrogen bonding strength goes down, those amylose and amylopectin molecules can move further and further apart. As they move further apart, water can begin to replace the amylose-amylose hydrogen bonds with amylose-water hydrogen bonds. So as that water begins to be taken up by those granules, the viscosity goes up, the water activity begins to go down. So fresh pasta is extremely challenging to preserve. Why? Because the water activity is so high. When you talk about pasta that you make at home and you just throw into a pot of boiling water, the structure of that pasta, the chemistry of that pasta is extremely different than the pasta you consume at home or the pasta you make fresh. You should be able to taste differences between the pasta you're eating today and that pasta that you're having at home when you're just throwing it in a pot of boiling water. We have to convert that pasta into a glass, right? We have to remove that water and we create that brittle solid that is a glass. Again, remember the difference between a glass and a crystal is that in a glass there's no lattice structure. Those molecules aren't arranged in a periodic structure. They're confined by this kinetic mobility. So the viscosity gets so high as that water begins to be removed from the product that we get this glassy state of immobilized solids. So we talked about the difference between a pane of glass and a crystal. This is important when we design foods. So when we make a pasta that's a fresh pasta, we can incorporate more water into it. We can incorporate more fat into it because we don't have to worry about the preservation. We don't have to worry about getting that water activity so low that deteriorative reactions aren't going to take place. So all of this plays an important role in understanding structure. We use these starch molecules to structure so many different kinds of foods, pizzas, starches, but also soups, sauces, condiments. All of these things rely on starch to give the unique viscoelastic properties. But remember that starch and the structure that it entails is dependent on the non-covalent interactions between amylose and amylopectin. So you take your starch-based product and you put it in your fridge. What's going to happen? It's 4 degrees Celsius, hydrogen bonding's at its maximum. The network is going to begin to constrict. It's going to begin to contract. That's the whole concept of retrogradation. Why you should never store your bread in the refrigerator. Right? So all of this plays an important role in determining structure. When we talk about that fat, the cream sauce that's on top, think about it. It's not quite a liquid, but it's not a solid either. Now, from a processing standpoint, the technology that goes into this is remarkable. The fact that you can cause that material to flow, so you can take it from the piping gun or whatever it is that you're applying it with, and apply it to the surface of that ravioli, and it stays there. Same thing as ketchup, and we had that embarrassing conversation about ketchup, in how fluids flow. So this isn't only important when we talk about the sensory attributes, it's extremely important when we talk about the processing of food. So if this sauce were something we were going to be transporting across a plant, how does that flow? How does that flow within the piping? How does it flow within the heat sterilizer? Not only that, but in this one, the browning reaction is actually beneficial. We want that brown color to begin to appear. We want Maillard reaction to happen. If we didn't, we would use HTST, right? We'd go to really high temperatures for really short times to try to preserve that nutrient quality. Now, when we start to talk about culinology, we don't always have to worry about the nutritional aspect of every meal we consume. We can indulge, we can enjoy. It becomes part of an experience. I promise you that when you graduate 10 years from now, this class, this lecture will be what you remember. That association with food and eating, triggering your senses, it changes how your memory adheres to information. All of this is about food, and we forget the importance that food has in our daily lives, not only from sustaining a basic metabolic function, but the cultural aspect. The fact that when you go home for Thanksgiving and Christmas or any other religious holiday, irrespective of what your ethnic background is, food is always central to every celebration we have. Weddings, bar mitzvahs, Chinese New Year, it doesn't matter. Food is centrally important to everybody. We take for granted the access we have to such a diverse food supply. We don't rely on a single food, a staple food, to get our substance. We get the luxury and the privilege to be able to interact with foods that we enjoy. Many of you will fall in love over meals. First dates, think about it. Where do you go? You go to restaurants. You go to areas where food is accessible. It's important. It's important for more than science. But what's crazy is something that has such important social value also has such an important biological need. Now think about the structure of that food now. We've got that bread, that gluten network, that bolus has reached your stomach. And we've got this churning happening, right? We've got those peristaltic waves that are contracting your food, that are mixing your food with the digestive enzymes. Those digestive enzymes are breaking down the proteases, the lipases, the amylases. They're breaking down those nutrients so they can be bioaccessible, so they can perform a biological function in you. So you can get... Is that music on here? Yeah, it is. You get the biological value of those sugars, of those fats. So again, trying to understand the implications of food is so complex because of the social value, the biological value, the importance for food security. There's so many aspects that are so important. But what's incredible about it is that our body is designed to be satiated by the chemicals that you taste. And those taste receptors that determine whether or not something is sweet, something has a umami flavor, if something is astringent. We have those same taste receptors throughout our gut. And that's triggering all kinds of homeostatic pathways, ghrelin, leptin, CCK, all of these enzymes and hormones which trigger changes in behavior, changes in satiety. The fact that there are so many complex interactions between these enzymes. Not only are they perceived and released when we consume food, they're also important when we're in a fasted state, when we haven't consumed food. So your neuropeptide Y family triggering hunger, our biological drive to eat. What stops us from eating? And what happens when those mechanisms go awry? When obesity becomes the norm in society? We have to begin to think about how to tackle these problems, but still getting that culinary experience that we want, that we desire, that we crave. All right. 1 second. We're ready when you are? But what's remarkable about this, again, is that the receptors in your mouth that determine taste are found throughout your entire GI tract. We have the ileal brake, right? The ileal brake is the release of CCK from the distal end of the ileum, right before it goes into the colon. Feedback inhibition slows down gastric emptying. Why? So those foods can become denatured. Why do you want them denatured? Because when proteins are denatured, they unfold. They expose those hydrophobic amino acids. They give surface area for those enzymes to begin to degrade that food. By slowing down gastric emptying, the amount of distension in our stomach stays elevated for longer. You feel full for longer. So can we design foods that rely on playing with that ileal brake, that play with or modify the rate of gastric emptying, so you're satiated longer? Yeah. Can I come here? Sure. Yes. I gave away your shirt. Oh, yes, you were the one that was really involved in Twitter the most, I think. We'll give a clap. So right now, that's going around is a mushroom and tofu quiche with a Brownie salad with balsamic dressing. Now, Remember, when we talk about sugars, monosaccharides, disaccharides, glucose, fructose, sucrose, maltose, irrespective, they play an extremely important role in structure, right? Whether or not that sugar is going to crystallize, or if it's going to form a glass or not crystallize. That's extremely important. How that hardness of that dough is perceived is dependent on the amount of sugar that's present. Remember, we talked about taking the corn industry, which we have about 5,000 farms in Canada producing enough sweet corn for the population, and about another 100,000 that produce corn for silage and for the food industry, producing starches. All of this is extremely important. When we talk about tofu and egg whites, gelation of protein is extremely important. Remember, when we did the egg, we reverse hard boiled it. We got the yolk to gel while that liquid stayed solid. So denaturation of a protein is dependent on the primary structure of that protein, right? Which amino acids are present, but it's also dependent on how they pack. Is it an alpha helix or a beta sheet? When it's in an environment, in this case in an aqueous environment, how does the ternary structure fold? Is it a globular protein? Is it a fibrous protein? So by modifying the temperature and the time at which we expose proteins to changes how that structure is established. We can create very grainy networks, very hard, very solid networks, or we can create very creamy, soft textures. And again, this is using the same ingredients, but just manipulating how we process it, how we cook it, how we expose it to heat. When we talk about the denaturation of proteins, not only is it the egg in here, but the tofu. So with tofu, it's a different type of gel, right? Tofu isn't a heat set gel. How do we set a tofu gel? What do we use? We use acid, right? The acid denatures the protein, causes it to unfold, right? We change the charge. So proteins can be negatively charged, positively charged, or they can have no net charge if there is a Zwitter ion. Now, with tofu manufacturing, we want to be at that isoelectric point. We want that the Zwitter ion to exist. Why? Because we want that protein to denature. We want it to unfold. We want the viscosity to be enhanced. But we also need to not have electrostatic repulsion, right? So if we were in a basic environment and had a positive charge, we would get electrostatic repulsion between those proteins. If we were in an acidic environment, a basic environment, we would have a negative charge. So at that isoelectric point, we have a positive charge and a negative charge. Those proteins then are forced to interact, forming that three-dimensional network structure, which actually entrains the water, which creates the structure. It changes the elasticity of that tofu. So depending on how you make that tofu, what type of acid you use, the rate of acidification changes the structure of that protein, changes how your oral cavity interacts with it. It changes the oral food processing. That oral food processing changes how flavors are released, how flavors coat your tongue. All of this is determined by structure. That structure, excuse me, that structure determines how elastic, how springy that food is. Again, all of these are used in determining whether or not you have a sensory aversion to it or if it's sensory appealing. And again, so it's not just dependent on if you make good ingredients and source good ingredients. It depends on what you do to those ingredients. How do you process them? How do you cook them? What do you mix them with? What type of acid do you use to gel your protein? What temperature do you gel your protein to? How long do you gel your protein for? And the benefit with culinology, we don't have to worry about if it's shelf stable. We don't have to worry about if the moisture in the egg is going to migrate into the crust, into the pastry. Because if we had to worry about that, we would have to change the formulation. We would have to change the way in which we structure water. How do we do this? We add molecules that bind water, things like sugars, things like salts. We add chemical preservatives. So by having freshly produced foods, we don't have to worry about that preservation. We don't have to worry about the shelf life of that product. So we can design foods, or we can make foods from a sensory perception that are much more appealing. So these types of foods that you're consuming now would be very, very difficult to mass market, right? We would have to think about how we structure it. We would have to think about how those foods interact. What's remarkable about foods is our body responds and changes in response to food. And not everybody responds the same way. As an example, we've talked about the gut microbiome. One of the things that we see change most quickly in response to diet. I found a study that I didn't present in class, but what's really interesting is if you look at people who emigrate to Canada and North America from Asia to the United States, the change in diet, the change in your source of food is significant enough to change your gut microbiome. And it's measurable. Why is this important? Because depending on what biome you have will determine whether or not you're in dysbiosis or not. Do you have an elevated risk for disease? We talked about how it interacts with the hunger hormones. Does it change the level of satiation? If it changes the level of satiation, could your gut microbiome be implicated in things like obesity? We know that it can take a safe molecule, methyl red, and it can convert it into a carcinogen. What is the consequences if your gut microbiome has something that produces one of those azoreductases? So again, this moves to that whole concept of personalized nutrition. Your gut microbiome, your genetics determine how your foods are metabolized, which can change how healthful something is for one individual compared to another. We've talked about how food and how processing of food has literally changed our evolutionary path. We've gone from very large teeth with much dentation, really designed for crushing grains, for breaking small seeds. Foods that were 200, 300, 400 years ago were so low in biological accessibility, right? That grain, that flaxseed, had to be broken down. The germ was much greater in content than the endosperm. We've selectively bred plants, so they're functional for the food industry. So what have we done? We've selected cultivars that are high in endosperm, high in starch, because that's a value-added commodity, that are low in bran, right? Bran's not functional. Great from a fiber perspective, great from a micronutrient perspective, horrible. I was going to say that's a combination between poor and horrible. Horrible from a functional ingredient standpoint. Again, all of this determines how we interact with our food. The introduction of fire, the advent of cooking your food, has literally changed our evolutionary path. We can see this in the physical makeup of foods. Depending on whether your ancestry comes from a high starch diet or a low starch diet, changes the amount of amylase you produce. If you produce different amounts of amylase, you break down starches at a different rate. If you break down starch at a faster rate, foods are going to have a higher glycemic index. So markers for health are individually dependent based on your genome. Again, making an argument to move away from this one nutrition to an individualized, personalized nutrition. Again, when we look at the evolutionary path of our high starch consumers and our low starch consumers, not only does the amount of amylase change, production change, but your predisposition to obesity changes. So your lineage, your genetic profile, can make you more susceptible to becoming obese? Is that because you select for foods that are sweeter or more carbohydrate rich? Or is it because they break down at a different rate? We don't know. But again, all of these questions are extremely important when we go forward. Yeah. All right. So next, we have the torched flank steak with chimichurri sauce. We got someone that likes it. So again, when we think about the structure of meat, the interactions between actin and myosin in the sarcomeres, all of those interactions are dependent on the non-covalent interactions that stabilize that meat structure. And all of that is intermixed with collagen. That collagen is extremely tough. The amount of collagen in meat is dependent on where that cut of meat is from. So muscles that aren't used extensively, right? Along the spine of the animal, the back, the T-bone, the filet mignon, the porterhouse, those have much, much less collagen. They're not nearly as tough as, let's say, a brisket or a flank steak. But you can change the toughness of steak and meat by changing how you cook it. So if you cook it under very, very low temperatures for very long times, you're not drying it out, you're not pushing that moisture out of the meat, you're slowly denaturing that collagen, you're breaking up that triple helix. When you break up that triple helix, all of a sudden it becomes like when you make your Jell-O shots at home, right? It becomes that watery mixture. So if you take a steak at home, or a prime rib, or a really good cut of meat, and you cook it, the worst thing you can do when you finish cooking it is to start eating it. You have to wait. You have to be patient. You have to let that meat cool down. Why? Because you've converted that triple helix of collagen into this liquid mixture of protein. When you let it cool down, those triple helices try to reform. Just like when you mix in your vodka and give it time for that gelatin to set and create a gel. So if you cut meat right after you've cooked it, you lose all of the flavor onto the plate. You can see it bleeds out. It doesn't hold the juiciness. Wait 10 minutes. Let that temperature get down below 120 degrees Celsius, and you'll notice that that structure, that ability to bind water changes. And again, remember, when we're dropping temperature, hydrogen bonding is starting to be re-implemented. Now, remember when we talked about this assimilation of proteins being highly dependent at time of synthesis? That order to get a triple helix can't be replicated in the lab. So after you've cooked that meat, that triple helix doesn't reform. Very small segments of it does. So we get this beautiful three-dimensional network that entraps the fat, that entraps the water, that holds the water-soluble flavors. You want to heat sear that surface, right? Why do you sear the surface? You want to lock in as much moisture as you can. And you want to lock that moisture in so it can interact with that protein. So it's not tough, so it's tender, so it's juicy. The flavor perception is dependent on the network structure of that protein. But again, when we think about food, and we think about the cultural aspects of food and the importance food plays in our everyday lives, what's remarkable about it is, irrespective of your ethnic background or where you come from in the world, food is an underlying theme in all celebrations. In Muslim, in Christianity, in Hinduism, food is a central part of family. We build interactions, our social network is dependent on food. And our response to food depends on the environment we're in. I could sit here and feed you probably 10 times the amount of food that you would normally eat at home because of social cues. The lighting, the ambiance, the size of the plates, the color of the plates, how many people you're talking to. All of that changes the amount of food you're going to eat. So again, We can override biological mechanisms that are designed to control the amount of food simply by changing the environment you eat that food in. We can make sweet foods taste sweeter based on the color. We can trick your brain into tasting flavors that aren't there by putting color into food. We control your sensory perception of foods through so many different ways, not just the taste, the aroma, the ambiance, the processing of that food. All of these things change how you interact with your food. Food is instrumental in every celebration in your life. In graduation, in birthdays, in having a child be born, in death, we celebrate with food. Again, the importance of food isn't just about talking about the chemistry and processing of it. It's not just talking about the nutrition of it. So when you go into your respective fields, you've got to keep into mind the social implications of food. What drives us to eat? If you're depressed, if you've just gone through a breakup, you go to food, you go to your comfort foods. If you're physically active, you have a different set of foods you consume. Food and behavior are so closely tied together that it's so difficult to discern between the two. Those are my boys. I know, they're the cutest kids in the world. If you guys have kids, anyone, I'm sorry, but mine take the cake. The little one up in the top is now 5. His name's Logan. And the bottom one, he's the older one. That's Kieran. He's 7. So this is for their first birthdays. And again, it's funny because these are the moments I remember. I remember the cake splattered on their face. Every year, it's always a picture we get. We always get a picture at Christmas with food. And these, again, are essential. Again, those are my boys, and that's my wife, Darcy, who has to put up with me. But again, food is instrumental in determining in parties and celebrations. Yeah. But again, by just introducing food into this lecture, I promise you, this will be one of the lectures you remember 20 years from now. It is one you're going to talk about. And it's not because I'm such a dynamic, great professor. It's because food is a social cue. It changes the way you interact with information. So as you're eating this food, it's like when you do exams or take notes. That physical act of writing helps embed stuff into your memory. Eating, smells, tastes are triggers for emotions. You remember the meals you ate when you met the love of your life. You remember the meal you ate at your wedding. These are all things that are socially imprinted onto you because of the experience they have. So next, we're going to have a mango sorbet with phenyltrealy and a red pepper gel. Now, when we talk, does this have sound? I forget. We don't need the sound. When we talk about the conversion of an aqueous system into a solid through crystallization, doesn't matter if it's for fat or if it's for water and ice cream, we have to undercool it, right? That concept of undercooling relies on the ability to get the temperature of that system below the melting temperature. So crystallization always happens below the melting temperature of that product. So here we have a bottle of water at -5 degrees Celsius. Thermodynamically, that's ready to crystallize, right? We're below the melting point. So we've supercooled it, we've undercooled it, we've supersaturated it. But that formation of a new phase requires the formation of that interface. And that interface is energetically unfavorable. So we have to overcome that energy. How do we do it? We can do it by cooling further and further and further and removing more energy from that system, or we can add an impurity. We can seed chocolate. We can put in the crystal polymorph we want to drive crystallization. Here, We can put crystal nuclei in. So when you watch, they touch the ice cube to that surface, we're not getting nucleation here. We bypassed the nucleation event. Now we're just seeing crystal growth. So now we don't have to subcool as much. So we can change the structure of ice based on how we cool it, based on if we introduce shear. Now that complexity of frozen foods is magnified because we add sucrose to it. We add salts to it. We get that freezing point depression. When we pull out those ice crystals, we get the concentration of the sugars, the polysaccharides, the gums that are present in this unfrozen phase. And when we get that freeze concentration of those products, we get a reduction in the freezing point. So that unfrozen phase of that sherbet, which is giving you that soft texture, depends on the micronutrients that are present, depends on the amount of sugar, depends on the amount of salt, depends on the gums, the carbohydrates that are present. So as we crystallize out that water, we're concentrating in the unfrozen phase the sugar. That changes the sensory perception. That changes when that sweet perception is perceived. As we freeze concentrate, we depress the freezing point. Why is that important? Because if that sherbet were an ice, complete block of ice, it would be like putting an ice cube in your mouth. The sensory properties of that would not be very desirable. So the mouthfeel, the interaction on how it coats your tongue, that changes how fat molecules diffuse through to the taste buds. That changes your perception of that fat creaminess. It changes how sugar is perceived in the mouth. The size of those crystals is dependent on how you cool it. So if you flash cool it or if you cool it really quickly, you get a large nucleation event and less crystal growth. Your crystals are smaller. Why does that matter? Because if you have large crystals, they're going to be grainy on your tongue. That's going to give you a sandy, grainy texture. Notice how smooth that texture is. It's not by accident that you process a food to get that structure so those ice crystals are small, so your palate doesn't detect them. It's smooth like velvet. That changes how your palate interacts. It changes the way flavors are released. All of this, again, goes into whether or not you are pleased with the product or displeased, whether you'll buy it again, whether you won't. The challenge with this, when you want to industrialize it, how do you keep those ice crystals small? You take that ice, that sorbet, or that ice cream, you create those beautiful crystals in the plant, and then you put it in your blast freezer, and then Billy the truck driver comes along and leaves it on the loading dock. And all of a sudden it begins to melt. And those ice crystals begin to shrink and shrink and shrink until the small ones are gone. Now, you get to the grocery store and responsible manager Bob puts it into the freezer. The big ice crystals begin to grow. The small ones don't gain back their size, they disappear. So we have fewer crystals that are larger and grainier. So when you buy an ice cream that's been sitting on a grocery store a grocery store freezer for months, and you have those little indecisive kids that open it, not knowing which product to buy, the temperature rises, it's closed, the temperature drops. It's up and down. That temperature cycling causes those ice crystals to grow. So how do we structure foods to prevent that? A huge problem in the frozen food industry. In things like ice cream, it's not as big of a deal as it is in something that has a cellular structure. Something like meat, frozen fish, frozen vegetables. If those ice crystals get too large, we begin to rupture structures. If we begin to rupture structures, what begins to happen? We get decompartmentalization of enzymes. When you freeze certain foods, they brown, right? We can't put bananas into a fridge. So we have to be cognizant of what's happening. There. So when we talk about the structure of frozen foods, the complexity, think about the different phases. You have fat, you have water, you have unfrozen water, frozen water, you have water that's concentrated in sugar, in carbohydrates, in polysaccharides, and gums. The viscosity, the way that melts in your mouth, the way it coats your tongue is very rationally designed based on the ingredients and processing of that food. Again, you can't make good quality ice cream or sorbet without sugar. When that water is freezing out, we're getting this unfrozen phase. That unfrozen phase depresses the freezing point. That means that you have a component of that system that's not frozen, which makes that texture velvety and creamy. The amount of sugar we put in there, the amount of salt, the type of sugar, all of that changes not only the sensory perception, how it tastes, but also how it feels. And how foods feel in the mouth are extremely important. It changes the way flavors are delivered, and it changes the way we perceive that food. Now, what is crazy about foods is that we have literally changed. One sec. Okay, we're ready when you are. So the idea of food and nutrition, we have had remarkable success in the last 200 years with the advent of the Western diet. We have changed life expectancy. We have literally in 250 years doubled life expectancy from 35 to over 70. We've changed the height of individuals based on meeting those basic dietary needs. But now we've come to a point where those positive advancements, where those, think about the food, we don't worry about how safe it is. We consume milk without worrying about if we get scarlet fever. And after having scarlet fever this year, let me tell you, I would never drink unpasteurized milk as long as I live, if that is a 1 in a million consequence of it. But we've changed the prevalence of tuberculosis based on how we process foods. We see how important it is. Just look at the media. Go into a grocery store today and try to buy romaine lettuce. Now think about if you grew up on a farm where you were producing romaine lettuce, how devastating this would have on your economics. So food is so closely integrated and so industrialized now that it becomes difficult to trace where pathogens are. So how do we create now a stable, seasonably available, safe food supply? We need to come up with new technologies. Microorganisms are becoming resistant to the technologies we use to control them. So we've got to rethink our food processing industry. We've got to rethink about how we get rid of them in foods. We can't continually use heat to break down micronutrients in a hopes to get a shelf-stable product. We have to develop new processing technologies that will give us the same shelf life, but that will maintain the nutritional quality. This is becoming more and more important with a health-conscious society. So now, the final round is our chocolate brownie with mint meringue and ganache. Now, chocolate. There are so many things I can say about chocolate. The first, most important, when we talk about the chemical structure of chocolate, we rely on the fact that chocolate and all fats assimilated in nature do so in a restricted random way, right? They choose preferentially where to put those fatty acids. So in chocolate, almost every triglyceride has 2 saturated and 1 unsaturated at position 2. That means that the melting temperature for cocoa and chocolate is very narrow, right around that of the temperature of your mouth. So when you put something with chocolate in your mouth, the structure very quickly goes from solid to liquid. And that liquid conversion changes how those molecules migrate through the food to reach your taste buds. So that perception of sweet, bitter in chocolate is dependent and reliant on the fact that it's going to break down and coat your tongue. So if we go and we use a cocoa butter substitute, like that little disc of fat we talked about in class, it doesn't melt quite right. It doesn't have quite that right melting temperature. So instead of letting it melt in your mouth, you have to chew it, right? Changes the sensory perception. But not only does the ingredients change how that chocolate is perceived, it relies on that process of tempering, right? So when we talk about going from that liquid state to the crystal state, depending on how those triglyceride molecules arrange themselves in three-dimensional space, changes that polymorphic form. Changing that polymorphic form changes whether or not that crystal is a small spherulite or a large granular platelet. That determines if when it melts, if it's very smooth and velvety or if it's coarse. By changing and tempering chocolate, we get that polymorph that melts right at your biological temperature, right around the temperature of your mouth. Once that gets out of whack, you can have a chocolate that will melt in your hands, but not in your mouth. I should have worn my M&M bow tie for that one. Or you can have a chocolate that doesn't melt at all in your mouth, simply by how we crystallize it. Now, when we talk about industrialization of chocolates, we have to worry about, again, that temperature abuse, the shelf life. So now we have an aqueous-based meringue on top and a fat-based brownie. We're going to get migration of water, migration of oil. That's going to change the structure of that food you consume. So if we were to put that on the shelf and leave it for a week, the structure of that meringue would become very, very soft and mushy. The texture of that brownie would become hard and brittle. So what technologies, what ways can we change or manipulate those ingredients or the processing characteristics to get you that characteristic flavor? When you start making ganaches and the fat you're using, the cream in this case, that you're using to cut that hard stock cocoa butter with, changes the texture, the way it flows, if it's going to stay on top of the food, if it's going to flow around the food, all of that is rationally designed. And we use science to develop very novel and very unique foods. Foods that give us our sensory perception, which makes us feel good when we're in times where we're depressed. We go to things like ice cream and chocolate when you've had a bad day or a bad breakup. Foods are integral into how we live our lives. When we talk about a meringue, that little tiny droplet on top, meringue structures are remarkable. We have to introduce the right amount of bubbles, the right amount of air, so it's light and fluffy, but we have to release it at exactly the right point. When you're a child, you make your volcano experiment, right? You mix baking soda, you mix vinegar, a whole bunch of gas is released, and then it collapses. Well, what good is introducing bubbles if that network collapses? So we used cream of tartar, which is sodium baking soda, which releases carbon dioxide when exposed to acid, but we select tartaric acid because it breaks down and acidifies very slowly. So that gas, those bubbles, are released while that meringue is cooking. Why is that important? Well, as we're denaturing those proteins, we're creating a network that's capable of entraining those air bubbles. So we can get that light, fluffy texture by choosing when that sodium bicarbonate releases carbon dioxide. And by changing when that gas is released, we modify how fluffy and how light that is when we cook it. We do this with meringues. We do this with all kinds of different foam-based foods. So again, not only is it dependent on the sodium bicarbonate, the amount of carbon dioxide released, it's dependent on how you cook and denature those proteins, those egg whites that structure it. So all of that plays an extremely, extremely important role. But remember, the technologies that we use to make the foods that we love and crave are also becoming a source of concern in Western society. There is nothing more important than diet-related diseases and trying to treat diet-related diseases very early on, because chronic manageable diseases are extremely expensive. And about 50% of the adult population is affected with type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, metabolic syndrome, obesity. This is just going to become more and more prevalent. We need to change the way we think about the industrialization of our foods. We need to think about our relationship with foods and how can we adapt our food supply to meet our needs. Because if we want that next jump in life expectancy, if we want to get out of the 80s and into the 100s, it's going to be dependent on the foods we eat as much as the medicines we have. So we need to rethink our food supply. And the challenge is that diseases related to diet do not stem from a single food source. It is that complex interaction with all the foods we consume over our lifetime. So it's the chronic effects. And this is staggering. For the first time in human history, more people are going to die from chronic diet-related diseases than bugs and germs. Totally changes the mandate of the UN. And this is not a Western society problem. This is an affluent society problem. Obesity rates in children are skyrocketing. We need to rethink how we process, how we refine foods. We need to rethink our food supply, and it's your generation that's going to have to do it. And with that, the course is now over.
So for the exam, I will be sending an email. Surprise! I'll send out the topics next week. I'm just going to call the crew in and thank them. Thank you guys for all helping. I hope you enjoyed the course. I hope you learned something. I hope it inspires you maybe to take another food course or another nutrition course. And I hope that the rest of your 2 years, 3 years here at Guelph are enjoyable.